budget. And what's the target for Kenya Revenue Authority? 3.3 trillion shillings. And that is the number that we are working with this morning. But as we wait for the Cabinet Secretary for National Treasury to deliver his speech at 3 p.m. before the National Assembly, as we get now to know the real figures that we're going to work with for the next 1 year. We'll be looking also at the previous year and see how the current financial year in terms of numbers and how the allocation have been, as we also look at the Finance Bill 2024 and look at these tax proposals that have been proposed in the bill. Now, to delve into the overall expenditure and also looking at what the Cabinet Secretary will be presenting for us this afternoon, I'll just give you a breakdown, but that will be coming after this short story as we head to the National Treasury, where the National Treasury is finalizing preparations leading up to the budget reading this afternoon. Now, the Director for Macro and Fiscal in the Department of National Treasury says final touches are underway to make sure what Treasury CS reads at the National Assembly is correct. Now, our reporter Alan Oko has just caught up with the director who explains what it takes to prepare the national budget. Let's take a look at that.
It's finalized to the best of our abilities and with this guidance. And I think we are nearly there. We are just on the final touches. I think I'm doing the rest. We are doing the rest miles. This process, for your information, takes about 12 months. And I think when you see us here, we began preparation of this thing in July last year. We begin by first looking backwards to see how in the other previous financial year closed. And then around September, we put this together into what we call the budget review and outlook paper. And the purpose of that document, which is sent to Cabinet and Parliament, is to review the fiscal performance the previous year, but also provide what we call the ceilings or the expenditure ceilings for the budget that we are dealing with. And that is done by a team that we sit together with, the macro working group, an intergovernmental group with various agencies. We have National Treasury, State Department of Economic Planning, Central Bank of Kenya, Kenya Revenue Authority, Commission of Revenue Allocation, Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, and KIPRA. And those technical teams develop the policies going forward. Subsequently, of course, and you are aware, we prepare the budget policy statement that is taken to Parliament in February 15th, latest, after due processes, approvals by Cabinet. And after that, people now embark on, and that creates the policy. People then embark on preparing the detailed budget, and then and the finance bill, taxation measures, and all that, meeting all the stakeholders and putting together a package that government can forward to Parliament for consideration. And that is, we submit this on April 30th. And I think those documents, that's the detailed budget and the finance bill, are now on the floor of the House. So after that, the best we can do is now to do the final or the last mile, which involves the speech, the other critical documents that we prepare, issues of the, I think you are aware of documents like Mwananchi Guide. I think these are some of the documents that will be later shared. Of course, the speech is others. There are quite a number of documents that will be shared after the statement. And I think that's the most intense activity that we do. To achieve this, we have teams that work throughout the year. For example, there are teams that we get from KRA and the State Law Office, which sit in this department continuously for almost 6 months, working on maybe proposals, legislative changes, and all those meeting stakeholders, and just kind of, it's a preparatory process for where we are. So basically, that's what we do as a department. Again, support government in its day-to-day policy formulation and help the minister. So what you see now is final touches, people editing numbers, checking numbers. That becomes very critical because we cannot afford to have information or numbers that are not correct out there. So that's our number one item that we have to ensure. And then the rest is also to just allow the process. So I'm happy to host you and then show you around in some of our processes, both from the front office. We have various officers in other offices doing specific aspects related to this big day for the minister of the. Thank you.
Thank you. Before you show us around, I need just clarify something that you want to know as far as this whole process is concerned.
Maybe to the public is just to say that this is an unwearying exercise that we go through to put in together policies and measures that will help the economy to hold together. Literally, we don't spare any effort. We will work like I've just mentioned last night. We were leaving this office 1-2 a.m. Just to ensure we do the right thing for Kenyans and support this great economy. And I think we have met a number of them.
Alan Aoko there having a conversation with the Director of Macro and Fiscal at the National Treasury, that is Musa Gadenji, and our reporter Alan will be camping there till the National Treasury Cabinet Secretary heads to Parliament, and he'll be giving us details of how that will unravel. And also we have various reporters also pitched camp at Parliament. We have Abdi Aziz there. We also have in the CBD, Nairobi CBD, we have Trevor who will be giving us details of what's happening and the reactions from Kenyans out there. Our Wananchi are very concerned about what the numbers look like and also how the tax proposals will be implemented. And also we'll head to Kisumu, where we have Wycliffe there on standby, and also we'll have June who will also be handling the budget for us in Mombasa County. And we look at the 4 trillion shillings budget and how it looks like. Yeah, we'll be looking at the executive arm and also what has been proposed in terms of allocation. We'll also be looking at the consolidated fund services so that we can see what is in store for us. Now, we start with the executive arm, which has been allocated about 2.24 trillion shillings. That is out of 4 trillion shillings. And this comprises, of course, of recurrent allocation of 1.5 trillion shillings and development expenditure right there of 724.4 billion shillings. Now, the consolidated fund services, which will come up on your screen right there, the consolidated fund services are mainly used for servicing debts. It will get about 1.2 trillion shillings. Now, the consolidated fund services that is mainly used for debt repayment as well as pension for some salaries. Now, looking at the revenue collection target, we have 3.3 trillion shillings, as I had earlier on indicated. Now, what's the total budget deficit when you look at the expenditure side and we look at the revenue side? We'll see a budget deficit of about 606 billion shillings. And what does this comprise of? Of course, the government is saying it will borrow about 300 billion shillings from the domestic market and also 306 billion shillings from the external market. Remember, our debt keeps on rising right now. It's about 11 trillion shillings budget. So rather 11 trillion shillings debt. So how do we make sure that we pay off our debt on time and also pay off the interest that comes with this debt? We have a panel of team experts in studio who are going to break down for us and tell us whether we are in an unsustainable way when it comes to public debt. Now, the county allocation, which numbers also will come up later on, is getting 400 billion shillings, up from 385 billion shillings in the current financial year. And remember this, during this period, there was a mediation committee that was formed in order to bring up, or rather to show up this amount. Remember, in the budget policy statement, it was about 391 billion shillings, which was proposed, but through the budget and appropriation Appropriation Committee. This number has gone up and increased by about 20 billion shillings, and you can see now it's almost at 400 billion shillings. So what will judiciary get? Judiciary will get about 23.7 billion shillings. But before we look at that, let's look at top allocations or top gainers in this financial year that is starting July. We have education, which is getting the lion's share of the budget of about 700 billion shillings. Then we have the national security right there, which will receive about 373.5 billion shillings. Remember, these are just estimates. We'll have the final budget, which will be read by the National Treasury CS in Parliament this afternoon. The roads will receive about 178 billion shillings. And the health sector, which is key, is going to receive about 128 billion shillings. But looking at all of that, let's now get back to the panel that I have here in studio. And I have a panel of economic and tax experts who will help us now crunch the numbers. And I am joined by, on my far right, I'm joined by CPA Esther Wamalwa, who is the member of a policy committee at ICPAK. And also I'm joined by James Chwanya, who is a tax manager at PKF. And also just close to me here is Rachel Njuguna, who is an associate director in terms of tax at Ernst & Young. Welcome to our studios, Gath.
Thank you.
Now, when you look at those numbers, and I would like to start with you, Rachel. Right. When you look at those numbers, I would like you to tell me, what are your thoughts?
Thanks a lot for that question. My name is Rachel, as you said. I am an associate director at EY, looking after tax. I'm a tax advisor. And I've been in this business for many years, and every year the CS Treasury comes up with the budget proposals for purposes of, making sure the government has money to run its business. When I look at what are the proposals, and given the fact that KRA has been struggling to collect the tax revenue, for me, I still feel that maybe the budget proposals are very high. Maybe not. They may not meet the budget, but let's see how it goes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Your opening remarks, James Chwanya, when it comes to the numbers that you've just seen on your screen, you've also interacted with the budget policy statement and the Finance Bill 2024. What do you make of the numbers?
Thank you very much. I want to pick up from where Rachel has left. I'm also of the opinion that that is a very expensive budget. Going by the numbers that are on the budget policy statement and what we expect to be read today, that budget is quite expensive. Depending on where you look at it, I don't think most players within the industry, depending on which sector, there's no one who is really happy about the budget. Maybe perhaps the only person who is happy is the national government or the treasury. But if I look at the numbers and where those money is going to, majority of it, about close to 45 or 47% is going into debt reservicing. Very little is going into development, and majority is also going into recurrent expenditure. So we are literally left with a deficit that we have to meet, and where exactly do we get this deficit from? As Rachel has rightly pointed out, we have an issue in terms of the revenue collection. When I look at the numbers that were presented in March, we were slightly short of about 900 billion to collect. And if I look at the numbers realistically, I think probably by the end of this financial year, we will be about 600 billion short. The projected increase in revenue collection is about 300 to 20 billion addition. So I'm looking at a budget that has been put to do an additional revenue of close to 1 trillion in terms of collection. Now, where does this money come from? It comes from the ordinary mwananchi, because at the end of the day, the government wants to collect the taxes from the people. And the aggressive measures that have been put in the finance bill to try and collect this revenue, realistically speaking, that budget is quite unrealistic, going by the numbers that we had in 2020 to the numbers that we have now.
Okay. Yeah. Esther, Esther, do you share the same sentiments as James and Rachel when they say this is a very ambitious budget?
Thank you so much. I agree with them. Indeed, this very ambitious budget. If you look at the numbers, almost 4 trillion budget, and we are hoping to raise 2.9 from ordinary revenues. It's really, really ambitious budget. And just bearing in fact that even in this financial year, we might not be able to collect 100% of the local revenue. So meaning we will be starting off at a negative. So with that huge deficit, what does that mean? It will mean...
Okay. Esther, let me cut you short as we work on your mic. We apologize for that technical hitch. Now, I take you straight to the National Treasury, where we'll be speaking to the Principal Secretary, Chris Kiptoo, who is also there to also prepare for the budget that will be read in the afternoon.
So this is a ceiling that we have for resources, and each sector, therefore, is going to be operating in this manner. And we also look at that medium-term framework based on what we project as the macro environment. What is inflation? What is growth? What do we see revenue going? How do we expand? All those macro parameters. So we issue in that report. Then now we tell entities, proceed now and go and engage in your sectors based on the ceilings which have been provided. So you'll find that we have, for instance, we have about 10 sector working groups. So one, if we talk about security, we have another one called public administration and international relations. We have another one that is what we say GJLOs, governance, justice, law and order. That brings in all the, then agriculture, then health, then education. All those, so all those go together. They go and now, because ministries are grouped together and are co-chair and their secretariat. Treasury is only there to take notes. And provide guidance within the fiscal framework. So those bidding for resources goes on, and it's a 2-month process, October, November. By November, we now have a consolidation of what has come out, and we now begin to prepare a budget policy statement, draft. This is a draft that, once it's ready, needs to be subjected to public consultation. So we do what is called public hearings. So you've had us, we call the public and we say, this here is the budget policy statement, which has our revenues and do also expenditure.
Thank you, Alan Aoko. They are talking to the Principal Secretary for National Treasury, Chris Kiptoo. They are breaking down for us the budget process making and how we've gotten to where we are. Of course, he's talked about the process starting in last year and also now coming into this year. And now we have the budget policy statement, which was released, the draft. And now we'll be having now the final budget policy statement, which will now be read in Parliament this afternoon. Now, coming back to our conversation in terms of whether we are having an ambitious budget, and I was talking to CPA Esther Wamalwa. If you can just go back a bit in terms of what you were talking about, Kenya having an ambitious budget.
Thank you so much. Indeed, it's an ambitious budget. Having a budget of almost 4 trillion and expecting to collect 2.9 trillion in ordinary revenue is really ambitious. Already, we are not quite sure if, and indications are there, that revenue targets even for this financial year will not be met. So already, we will be starting off at a disadvantage. And with that, it's just increasing the gap that is there in the budget. What does that imply? It implies that there will be increased borrowings, both in the domestic and the international markets, in terms of just to cushion and be able to get what is required to meet the budgetary requirements that have already been put in place. So indeed, it's a very ambitious budget.
Okay.
Thanks.
Now, looking at the general economic outlook and looking at 2023 and its performance, and we saw through the economic survey, we saw a growth of 5.6% from 4.6% that was recorded in the 2022. I would like to hear from you, James. Have you felt the growth even as we look at this, the budget that is kicking off from July?
interesting that you would ask if we felt the growth, because I don't really think there's any of us who's actually felt the growth, because a growth in an economy of 5% would actually translate into money to my pocket. And if I look through the growth, I don't feel that I have that money in my pocket by the growth that we are looking at. So by the very projections or the very performance of the economy as presented by the economic survey, I don't think really the growth is felt in by the very people as it's supposed to be. And if we look through the projection or the anticipated growth, my colleague has just talked about us attempting to collect 2.9 trillion, up from what we had initially projected last year of 2.45. So we've really not collected that revenue, but still we want to collect more revenue in as much as there's no that growth is not really felt in by the people. If you look through the various sectors and the manner in which the various sectors have actually performed, we are still a net importer. Yes, there was a growth in terms of the exports in the country. I think for the first time we felt serious or more. We collected more revenue in terms of our exports, but that is also majorly because of the depreciation in the currency. So our currency really depreciated much last year. It has become a little stable this year. The interest rates are still high, because I think if I go by the numbers that are presented, the commercial interest rate, I think we are borrowing almost to a tune of close to 13 to 14% from the banks. And the government, being a player in the industry, is also borrowing from the same industry that we're borrowing from. So in as much as I would want to have the revenue in my pocket, I don't really have it, because I can't get that money from the bank, because the government has also become a competitor in the same industry.
Okay.
Yep.
As I come to you, Rachel, revenue collection is a share to the GDP, of course, as James has indicated there. KRA is expected to correct 2.9 trillion shillings from the ordinary revenue. But then again, when you look at the revenue collection as a share to the GDP, continues to decline. And it is attributed to increase in tax incentives, low tax compliance, now the continued effect of COVID-19. Now, and also the growth in the informal sector. I'd like to know, how do we now ensure that this revenue collection, whether we hit the target, and also we ensure that we collect whatever is required by the end of each financial year?
Thank you for that question. I want to take a step back and just look at our tax operating environment. First, our tax structure is based on a self-assessment basis, meaning that a taxpayer, whether individual or corporate, is required to self-assess themselves and pay the correct taxes. But what we know for sure is that levels are very low, and there could be very many reasons for that. So now what we are finding is that we have a tax collector who spends a lot of money in terms of trying to collect taxes where the taxpayers have not paid up what they are supposed to pay. As to why there is a low compliance levels, I think that's a very big discussion. But one thing that we need to note is that our tax system, again, is also very unpredictable. Every year, like everyone else, when we'll be listening to the minister today, we expect, of course, to hear about the various many tax changes that are brought into a tax legislation or proposed. And in fact, that conversation has been ongoing through the finance bill that was released this year. And that happened last year. So the question is, when we have a tax provision that is enacted for 1 year and then the following year it's scrapped, what is the benefit of doing that? And looking at the taxpayers, I mean, it becomes very difficult to plan, because our tax environment is very unpredictable. We're coming from a situation whereby there was a national conversation about a tax policy, and now we already know that it has been finalized, it will be implemented. So we want to see how government will implement this, because one of the proposals in the national tax policy is that tax legislation will remain static for at least 5 years, so that taxpayers can plan around that. I want to just pick one example. For instance, last year, it transportation of sugarcane from the farms to the factories was zero rated. Now this year there's a proposal to charge VAT at 16%. Therefore, there's a lot of unpredictability, and the moment we fix the unpredictable tax environment, then I think for sure maybe that will contribute to tax collection, because taxpayers can plan better. And I mean, so that we reduce the various oscillations around the tax correction and the revenue.
Okay. Before I go to CPA Esther Wamalwa, I'd just like us to go straight to Parliament and listen to what the leaders have to say when it comes to the tabling, or rather the reading of this budget. And I have Abdiaziz with me right there on your screen. Abdiaziz, good morning. If you can share with us, what are the leaders saying when it comes to this budget? I know there's a lot of reactions, mixed reactions towards this budget, but what are the leaders saying?
We're coming to you live, of course, from Parliament buildings, where we continue with our wall-to-wall coverage of this year's budget. That is the fiscal year of 24-25. As you rightly put it, Njenga, we are talking about this budget that is the highest in our history, and of course will be presented here to the corridors of the Augusta House by none other than Treasury Cabinet Secretary Njuguna, and of course the Professor will be coming in this afternoon. But we are trying to reach out to these members of Parliament, as well as governance experts, as well as economists, to just expound on how we reached here and how we're able to finance this highest budget we have ever received in our country under the Kenya Kwanza administration. Joining me for this particular talk is none other than KSS Member of Parliament, that is CPA Julius Ruto. Mheshimiwa, thank you for making time for us. You are the members of Parliament who canvass this particular issue of the 4 trillion budget. Now, how did you come about it? And of course, not just you, but the government as well. How did you come about the 4 trillion budget?
Thank you so much. You need to appreciate the fact that the budget-making process is a long process, commenced in the month of August, 30th August. That's when the budget circular is released by the CS for Treasury to state departments, MDAs, and then sector working groups are formed. In the month of February, budget policy statement is read out that gives indicative ceiling of each and every sector, each and every area of expenditure, focus, or an agenda that is being trying to address. Now we are at the tail end that today the Cabinet Secretary is coming in to present his statement. It's just about a statement, but budget estimates were already tabled in the House. They have been discussed, they have been adopted. Now after this one, it will inform now the appropriation bill that will come forth next week. As you've rightly asked, how did we come about 400 billion? Budget is a function of Parliament. You will appreciate that for the last a couple of weeks ago, we were engaging sector by sector. Some of the areas that were very critical is sector of education. You remember that there was, at the initial stage, because of the constraints in this budget on the expenditure side, the issues of financing the interest of the debt interest, where the country now is experiencing huge burden in paying off the domestic debt interest and the other concessional debt interest. All this put together, it was training the budget to be even beyond 4 trillion. It was going to almost 4.3, 4.5. But then this one was unrealistic. What this means, that sectors were forced to cut down their budgets. Starting from the office of the president, which cut down more than 200 billion, 200 or around 500 billion, office of the deputy president, and the other offices, they were forced to bring down. So it came down to around 3.9. But later, upon engagement of sector and listening to an NG, like a program to do with school feeding program, it had to be reinstated. You remember there was a bipartisan engagement between Senate and National Assembly on disagreement on the division of revenue. It also caused some other additional funds to be increased for devolution from 391 to 401 billion. So all those put together, it informed the why now the budget stands at around 400. So as to how it is there, as I've said, but still, I can still dare say that that budget is not sufficient. If you listen to every state department, every expenditure point, they still ask for a lot, for them to run, for operation, to support their programs. We have critical areas that this budget has tried to focus. One of the areas is on priority areas that the government is focusing, issues to do with health. We remember that now the new health administrative structure of SHIF, that is Social Health Insurance Fund, that is being put in operation from the month of July. It requires a lot of capital to restructure it, to support it, to make it run. That is another area. Areas I've said, confirmation of JSS teachers, which was critical. You remember a couple of days ago, there were demos around here, and JSS teachers are saying, look at this, we have been trained, taken through a rigorous training process with a lot of costs, but the money we are handing as interns are so peanut to the level that it is not consummate, and we are devoting our time to attend to the critical issues of the society, the issues of education and knowledge. So those are part of the issues that we are able to look at, and the Committee on Appropriation, Budget and Appropriation led by Ndindi Nyoro had to take in from sectors, every department led by every chairman of every committee were able to address it, and that is why we have a budget estimate of 4 trillion.
Yes, but Mheshimiwa, we have seen critical areas like the agriculture, health, as well as that is education. Budgets have been cut. Is it going to affect the service delivery at the end?
If you look at now, what is the core focus of agriculture? Core focus of agriculture last year and this year is focusing on production, because that is clear. The president spelled out, and this administration has focused on that one. Production, because few years, you remember Kenya had been reduced to a net importer of food. You see, when a nation has gone down to be net importer of food, that is a nation that is it's a nation that has lost its sovereignty. Because a nation that cannot feed its people has lost sovereignty. You are now in the masses of the lender. But what this administration has tried to focus, even through budget intervention, is to focus on subsidized fertilizer, focusing on like we have 10 billion that is focusing on subsidized fertilizer, 12 billion that is focusing on stimulating other crops, commercial crops, like the one that is focusing on production of edible oil, palm oil, issues to do with textile, cotton industry. We have around 12 billion. So in agriculture, it is shifted to focus on critical areas. Yes, there are some areas that might suffer for now, but because the resources are scarce. So when a cut is done, it is only going to affect on non-priority, quote-unquote, non-core priority, so that the available resources is taken to the core areas that is going to stimulate our economy. As I've said, production. The next phase of this budget now should focus on manufacturing. After production now, because some of the products like palm oil will take around 3 years to mature. After maturing, we now need to prepare the production area, the manufacturing. We need to stimulate manufacturing. In the long run, we attain creation of employment on our country and retention of the money that we are channeling out. Look at this budget we are preparing. Most of our money are flying out of the country because of importation. Food, importing. Edible oil, importing. Which country are we building? We are building an external economy, external employment, external farmer against our internal farmer. So this budget, though it is strenuous, though it denies some resources, some focus or some quotas, but it is shifting the focus to an area that is going to create our autonomy in terms of building our economy and creating our employment.
Rightly so, Mheshimiwa, when you talk about manufacturing, in the Finance Bill of 2024, we have seen manufacturers coming before the Molo MP, that is Kimani Kuria-led committee, talking about these issues and how those VAT as well as taxes that will be imposed by the Finance Bill of 2024, how it will affect the manufacturer. Even some of the manufacturers are even threatening to leave the country and go to other countries so that they can export to Kenya, or rather we can import in the country duty-free. So is this the way to go?
First of all, what this finance bill is also trying to address is the last statement you say, duty-free, what you call tax expenditure. As we talk now, Kenya, we are suffering more than 400 billion annually on tax expenditure, duty-free, because we are a deficient country. We don't have sufficient of our own internal supply. We are depending on external supply. So what this finance bill also is trying to correct that. And in any case, if you look at critically, I know any tax measures, always it has to affect an end, it has to support somewhere, it has to affect. There will be someone somewhere will be lamenting, there will be somewhere will be celebrating. So we are trying to create a balance. Even as a committee now, we are retreating to writing a report. We have listened to them. But at the same time, also we need to listen to our hand that, are we going to be dependent nation for a long time? Because we also have to be responsible citizens. So I know there will be some sacrifice that have to be made in the context of this one. So some of the reduction or removal or deletion of some sections that affect some sector of manufacturing, so that it can go to standardized VAT, is not with an ill motive, but rather is trying to create a balance. Otherwise, we had shifted our country to highly dependent on external. And of course, will that country survive? So as leaders, we'll have to strike the balance on that.
Okay, thank you, Mheshimiwa. I know you're very busy today. Thank you for your time. And of course, that is KSS Member of Parliament, that is CPA Julius Ruto, just informing us, or give us the intrigue on how we reach the 4 trillion budget, given that I told you it is a historical moment for the country. Not just here in the country, we do understand our neighbors also will be presenting their budgets before their various parliament, that is Tanzania and Rwanda. And of course, we'll duly inform you in our subsequent bulletins. But for now, I'm being informed by my director that we do have our very own, that is John Jacob Kiria in Nakuru. John, if you can hear me, good morning. What do you have in store for us on the other side of this country?
Good morning from Broadcasting House. Indeed, we're live from Nakuru County as the country continues to await the unveiling of the nearly 4 trillion budget to be read out today by the Cabinet Secretary for Treasury, that is Professor Njuguna. And the country finds itself once again in a quagmire, just like in previous financial year budgets, where the servicing of debt really gobbles up much of the money that should, in normal circumstances, really go towards development. Because generally looking at this year's budget, about 1.2 trillion shillings is going towards debt repayment. Well, just about 700 billion really goes towards development. And that really puts the country's budget really quite in a quagmire. But obviously, the other thing is there is a budget that Kenyans have interacted with largely. So much of what will be read out by Professor Njuguna will not really be a surprise being sprung, though, because Kenyans have interacted with this budget through the budget estimates as read by the Budgets and Appropriations Committee, and you've seen various parliamentary committees and relevant departments really going much into discussing what the estimates will be really and how much a department would need in terms of allocation. And surprisingly, the country plans out of this budget 3.3 trillion will be funded by you, the taxpayer. And who collects your taxes is the Kenya Revenue Authority. Once again, the Kenya Revenue Authority really has a huge responsibility in the financial budget of 2024-2025 to actually collect revenue worth 3.3 trillion. And that is what we'll be engaging one of the regional coordinators of the Kenya Revenue Authority, particularly on this side, that is South Rift, regards really what are some of the measures really they will be applying in terms of ensuring collection for this revenue. You're looking at a situation where, for example, to exceed or get to the number that we are talking about. For example, to the conclusion of this financial year, the Kenya Revenue Authority has offered a tax amnesty to taxpayers, and that largely goes towards ensuring that they achieve the target of what was set in the last financial year, or the financial year that is about to conclude, because we are about a few days towards the conclusion of this financial year. And that means then there are several methods really they have used towards achieving the target that was set in terms of the collection of revenue. Most of the times, really, you've had a situation where KRA never really is able to meet the target that is set by government in terms of revenue collection. Will it be different this time? Obviously, time will tell. But we expect to engage the regional coordinator for the Kenya Revenue Authority shortly. And once we have them on set, we'll be coming back to you. But for now, let me hand you back to Broadcasting House. We'll be back once the regional coordinator is here with us and, of course, to engage with us.
John Jacob Kiria there from Nakuru talking to us about what's the outlook for Kenyans out there when it comes to this budget, and also he'll be having a conversation also there with a top manager at KRA. And just to come back to a conversation, and I will be speaking now to Esther. You've had from CPA Julius Ruto, MP KSS, they are talking about focusing on production and talking about Kenya being a net importer, and also looking at sectors that have been affected by this budget cuts. Looking at the education, the agriculture sector, the health sector, we've seen reduced budget allocation. How does this affect service delivery?
Thank you so much. Yes, I've had the member of KSS talk about cuts that have had to be done in the sectors of health, agriculture. I think education. And with that, you know, when we are doing a budget, you have to balance, because there's the revenue and there's the expenditure. Unfortunately, there's usually limited resources, and whatever demands that are required by the different ministry, different sectors, most of the times they usually exceed the resources that are available. What does that mean? It means they have to be a delicate balance in terms of allocation of the limited resources to the different ministries or departments. And with that, if you look at the budget, like for example, the budget for what has been proposed, the budget for education, it has gotten a huge chunk of allocation, but almost half of it goes towards human resource related expenses, meaning the development expenditure is what it means that what the government can do is to give incentives that will spur growth, that will spur, especially let's say in the manufacturing industry. And with the manufacturing, there's a vision to increase its GDP, which is currently at 7.8% to around 20% in the year 2030. And how can they do this? They can do this by lowering the cost of industrial inputs. They can do this by having accessible and reliable energy. So just to incentivize these other departments or these other industries that can be able to spur the growth in the economy. Growth in the economy will only be realized if people have disposable income, and there'll be increase in disposable income for them to spend. That is what will spur the growth in the economy. And that will only be done if the cost of production is reduced. And I've had the MP for KSS clearly talk about the manufacturing, and that is what they want to concentrate on. Okay. So if that can be done in terms of reducing the cost of production, indeed, it will spur growth by creation of jobs and all that.
Okay, thank you, CPA Esther. I remember we are also live on our social media platforms at KBC Channel 1, and also you can tag me on Twitter at Njenga. And I have some feedback from you, Kenyans, and I would like also James also to chip in on this. There's one feedback here that if the government can focus on agriculture for food security and reduce the cost of doing business, just as Esther has indicated, and have a special fund for MSMEs, the country would be fine. Do you agree, James?
I totally agree. And I want to respond to what he's saying by the very budget allocation to agriculture. I've seen a cut on it. I think when I last checked the budget policy statement, it was just shy of 100 billion, maybe about 99 billion. Into the agriculture sector. Now, the agriculture sector is one of those industries that is very hard to tax, but is also one of those industries that contribute significantly to our economy. About 33% of our GDP is from the agricultural sector. And if I look at employment, I'm looking at about 40% employed of the total population from the agricultural sector, about 70 of which come from the rural areas. But then you look at the kind of aggressive measures that have been put forward for the agricultural industries. I saw a reduced, or rather the removal of exemptions that are there for agricultural pest control products and the inputs. Measures that the government is attempting to bring into force to try and rather increase the revenue on that taxation. But I also want to link that to the national tax policy, because if you look at the national tax policy, what the national tax policy recommends is that we need to move into those add-to-tax economy and try and introduce taxes and try and collect more revenue from the taxes rather than just limiting the taxation to a few employed persons. Now, how do we, or how are we able to collect the taxes from that revenue? First, it means we need to grow that industry. and to grow that industry, then we need to have more allocations towards that sector through the fund that is spoken about, and even more so on the amount that actually goes to the various departments within the ministry. If you remember back maybe about 20 years ago, we used to have what was called the Maputo Declaration, where we had members of the various African countries met to try and at least agree on how much contribution should go to the industry, and it was agreed then that at least 10% of our budget should go towards that industry to try and grow that industry. They met back again somewhere around 2014, 2015 in what they were calling the Malabo Declaration. But if I look through the contributions or the revenue or the expenditure that goes to that industry over time, I don't really think we have ever been able to attain a 10% expenditure in that industry. And these are some of the effects that in the long run make it very difficult to be able to draw taxes from that industry. If, for example, we'd be able to pump in more funds into that industry, we'd be able to ensure that the industry is well funded, then we'll be able to draw as much revenue as we'd want to the industry. Linked to that, I think, is the edible oil, because edible oil is an agricultural product. We are an importer of edible oil. I think if you look through what we import, machinery will come top, and then we'll also have edible oil, palm oil itself, which comes from Indonesia and Singapore. But then you look through the excise duty that has been put up on edible oil. It means that every household out here will be able to the cost on edible oil will go up, and it makes it very makes it very difficult for players within that industry to put much effort into the industry. So yes, I agree with the person when he says there's very little that has been done for agriculture, and maybe perhaps we need to take that to take more action on it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Picking up from what James have said in terms of the medium-term revenue strategy, which aims to, of course, provide a framework for tax systems reforms and also boost domestic revenue, but which has also been declining over time. Rachel, if you can maybe suggest to us some of the changes, from your opinion, whether some of the changes and tax proposals we are seeing in this finance bill in line with the tax reforms proposed in the MRTS and also in the national tax policy.
Okay, thanks for that question. What I've seen from the 2024 budget, and maybe going back to 2023, 2023 was more focused on direct taxation, whereas 2024 is indirect. And 2023 we saw a lot of tax rates going up, like for individuals with the creation of 2 additional tax bands. As to whether that increased income tax collections, that's a different conversation, but from the data that you've seen, it hasn't really contributed to more tax revenue coming from that sector. So going back to the medium tax revenue strategy and what the government is trying to do to make sure that the tax collections go up, we've seen there's the issue of taxation of the digital economy. Number one, we need to be alive to the fact that a lot of transactions are happening in the digital space, and not just in Kenya, even globally. And governments all over are trying to make sure that these people who are doing business over the digital platforms are able to contribute to the tax exchequer. And what you've seen is that there was introduction of the digital service tax at 1.5%. That was like a turnover tax. And there's also a proposal to scrap that off in the 2024 finance bill and replace that with significant economic presence concept, which will translate to about 6% of the turnover. And of course, I've seen so many taxpayers complaining about that. But when you look at it, what the government is trying to do is to try and move away from the traditional tax nexus or tax presence, and now try and see what economic activities are you deriving from the country, and are you paying some commensurate tax. Closely tied to that is the issue of minimum tax. A few years ago, of course, there was the introduction of minimum tax that, of course, course, didn't see the light of day, and now it has come back through the Finance Week 2024. And now this one has taken a different shape because this one is linked to what is happening globally, and there's the concept of the global minimum tax of 15%. So what you're saying is that every entity that is operating in a country must pay at least 15% corporation tax. There's that proposal, and we will wait to see what how that ends. The other thing is the issue of the digital, or can we call them the content creators. I know there's a lot of discussions around whether these people should be paying tax or not. But when we take a look, we can see that they're doing a lot of work, they're getting a lot of money because they're doing a lot of advertising on their platforms, and you've seen big corporates even advertising through their social media pages. And of course, there was the introduction of the 5% withholding tax on the payments that they are receiving. But what needs to be noted is that the 5% is not final tax, because what we are saying is that our tax legislation captures or catches income of a person. For instance, if that content creator is earning maybe 100,000, for example, in a month, and an employee is getting paid 100,000, remember the employee will be taxed on the pay-as-you-earn system, and is that these people have not been paying tax. Like for that example of the content creator, he will earn his 100,000 and maybe not tax. So what you are saying is that for us to ensure that everyone contributes to this kitty, then whoever is earning an income must be able to be pay tax, or our systems should be able to catch those people so that everyone contributes to the exchequer.
Okay, and we'll delve deeper into the wide array of taxes and administrative measures that are affecting different tax laws, and we'll be looking at that later on. But coming to you, James, earlier this week I had a conversation with the Principal Secretary for National Treasury, Chris Kipto, and he talked about these new tax measures, saying they were informed by, of course, the public debt, and he insisted that it must be reduced. And I'll quote him in terms of what he said. He said, "We have no room to take on more debt." And this is what is forming Finance Bill 2024. And we have a 3-year internal mechanism that we can achieve by only increasing domestic revenue and cutting expenditure. But when you look at how the government, in terms of expenditure, do you think it's balancing the need for increased revenue and also with the potential burden on taxpayers?
Now, if I look through that question and I look through the kind of statement that the Principal Secretary made, and it also goes in line with what they were attempting to ask the committee on the Departmental Committee on Finance and National Planning to try and ensure that the finance bill is passed as they want. I think critically looking at it, our debt expenditure... Allow
me to cut you short, James. We're going to head straight to the National Treasury, where the CS is currently speaking to our reporter, Alan Oko.
Major, could I say, undertaking for us, because as the National Treasury and all MDAs are involved in this, because it is our job to summarize our, let's say, government institutions, including regulators, are saying, and we summarize it into what is called the budget. But in that summary, we are also summarizing what are the resources available, because everybody is looking at the resources. So and what are the revenue-raising measures? Of course, in the end, everybody tries to look at the revenue-raising measures without looking, first of all, their policies and programs. That's where we are. Let me say this, maybe as an opening statement, is that we have come from a very, very, very difficult period. And we are happy that with the leadership of His Excellency President William Ruto and his deputy, Honorable Rigathi Gachagua, they have stabilized the economy. We have come from very difficult times. We have seen some few signals which are very, very strong. For example, the 2023 growth, economic growth was actually 5.6%. We have seen inflation coming down to 5%, to its target level in April. In May, it went to 5.1%, which is actually not significant. So it means that inflation has come down to its target. We have seen stability in the exchange rate, in the nominal exchange rate. The nominal exchange rate is the national relative price, so it tells us about stability in the totality of the economy. And there are so many other aspects that we can relate to. That tells us that there is a very strong, should I say, very strong evidence that economic recovery has started, starting from the last quarter of 2023. But it is also a very fragile recovery, given the way you have seen the shocks from 2021, the COVID, 2020, the COVID, 2021 to 2022, there was massive. We haven't seen that drought in 40 years. 2023, El Nino hit us very hard. 2024, floods are still continuing. Go back a little, then 2021, 2022, supply constraints, 22, global dollar shortage. And you can see all these, we lump them as negative shocks. They are persistent because we don't even know when they end, isn't it? And they create some permanent effect in the economy. In fact, one of the estimates is to show that we have been reversed. We have reversed our 20 years effort in terms of poverty reduction and the inequality. The drought itself affected not only household inequality but also regional inequality in a big way. It is one of the most catastrophic issues that you can do. So what are we saying? We are saying strong evidence of economic recovery. But that recovery is fragile. It has to be supported. Strong policies, strong policy reforms, strong programs, and very, very strong and targeted interventions. Interventions to correct virtually everything. This is how to put, that is the way we need to support it. You can imagine, for example, right now, every time we turn, what is one of the damaging, or should I say, severe problems that we face? Debt, isn't it? We have to solve it with different dimensions. The most important thing is to realize that every time the budget is mentioned, everybody talks about taxes, revenue measures, revenue-raising measures. But that is just one component. You're asking yourself, why do we raise revenue? There is one problem I want to emphasize. But it is not one problem. It is actually one problem in three problems. We call them trilemma. There is a one dilemma, but composed of three dilemmas, so we call it a trilemma. One of the things is that everything and everywhere you turn, everyone wants government to spend more, to increase expenditure. We want roads, we want electricity, healthcare, education. So everybody wants the government to spend more. But for government to finance those aspects, healthcare, infrastructure, electricity, education, all those, it requires a lot of revenue. The only way you can finance that is through tax revenue or debt. Debt has, the second problem is that you have limitations in terms of debt. Debt today can be income, but debt tomorrow is going to be an expenditure. The third problem is that if you can't finance those revenues or those expenditures through debt, then you have to finance them through taxes. And everyone resists high taxes. So that's why we call it a trilemma, or a three-dimensional problem. It's one problem in three problems. But we are going to overcome by looking at moderate ways of trying to solve the problem. So the budget today is going to emphasize on the policies that we need to implement, policies, programs, and intervention to implement to support that fragile growth, that fragile economic recovery. We want to make sure that we revive the economy so that it can generate jobs for the youth. And that's where we are. Simple as that. We want to revive the economy so that we can pay our debt. We have been buffeted by debt, and everybody has seen us moving from moderate risk to high risk of debt distress, isn't it? So essentially, it is something you read, you write in the papers every day. So we are confronting all these problems. And on top of that, we have to build roads, we have to support hospitals, And that's why we are reforming even the hospital, the universal health care. There's the school program. We have a new school program. We have a financing model. And we all have to support that in terms of resources. So in a sense, what we are doing is to summarize all that we have got from both MDAs and government institutions, plus the private sector, and then public participation in terms of what they have brought to us. That's what we summarize, that's what we present. But this year's budget, we want to emphasize two things. First, we have to protect that economic recovery. We can only protect that economic recovery through policy reforms, through the diverse measures of raising revenues, through programs, and through interventions. Okay, that is the most important thing. The second thing is that we have to, the policy reforms must go in different dimensions. With some of you, I don't know whether you look at data. If you look at our exports, manufacturing exports, there has been a secular decline of manufacturing export. It means that it is very difficult for the manufacturing sector to increase jobs. So in a sense, we have to look at it in terms of how do we resuscitate our exports. One of the points that has been very, very adequately talked about, and even ourselves in the National Treasury, is that we have to develop, protect, and regulate markets. Because once markets are not well regulated, they are not well governed, they collapse. They collapse with Kenya's investments. And there is no more investment in that sector. It means that poverty hits very hard. For some of you, you have written papers and articles on that. Look at the coffee sector. Look at the sugar sector. Look at the cotton sector, subsector. Wherever markets have collapsed because of poor governance, you know poverty has struck, investments have been lost, it has been very difficult to revive. Pyrethrum, okay, all those. That is one of the most important. So when I talk about policies, programs, and interventions, those are the issues that we are talking about. So markets governing is an intervention that is required. Hustler Fund is an intervention because we want to reorganize that market. We want to make sure that people move out of the bondage of, what are they called, Shyrocks, eh? The Shyrock is from the Merchant of Venice. I don't know why they say Shyrock, but it's a bondage of financial distress. We want to make sure that we have some interventions. So when we talk about, we need very strong policies, we need strong programs aimed at targeting different programs. By the way, when we talk about programs, we are also they are targeting programs. We want to target the youth. We want to target those people in the bottom of the pyramid in terms of what they need. That's why the Hustlers Fund is very, very important. So when we start by talking about bottom-up economic transformation agenda, you already know that bottom-up because majority of the Kenyans have been left behind, where markets have failed them, where policies have failed them, where government has not been able to invest in areas that they want, and we want to reverse all that. And those are the issues. I wanted to make those 3 points maybe so that you can have a feel that when budget making is not about taxes. Taxes comes in to say, after saying you are going to do all this, how are you going to finance it? Now,
all right, volunteers, maybe one of the things that has generated a lot of conversations is looking at the amount of this budget that is going towards recurrent expenditure versus development. So if you could tell us, are you concerned about that as the National Treasury when we have recurrent expenditure consuming close to 70% or more than 70% of the country's budget?
Actually, 3/4 of the budget discussions, if you ask these two guys with me, has been just that. How do you balance out? Because, look, many years back, when I was the governor of the central bank, I used to argue that even in times of crisis, make sure that you do not devour the development spending because you limit capacity for future growth. That logic is still there. That's why we are saying those interventions is to protect development expenditure. Because once you devour development expenditure, it means that you limit yourself in terms of future capacity for growth. That is why we are talking about interventions, to make sure that we safeguard some of these issues. That is why we really need that balance. But we go back to the trilemma. we go back to the trilemma. That is, I don't want to call it trilemma. You know, I just want to say it is a major problem. It is one problem, but with 3 dimensions or with 3 faces, isn't it? We want more revenues to spend. But how do we raise more revenue to spend? It's either through taxes or debt. The second problem, you have a limitation with how much debt you can carry, isn't it? The third one is that since taxes is the only one that is left now in that space, how much taxes can you raise? We also have resistance in terms of taxes. So what we are trying to do, and to answer your question, is that we are moving in a direction where we want to make sure that we have domestic resource mobilization that is amenable to the development space that we want. And we want to make sure that we remit our tax expenditure to build up a revenue base or a tax base, and also reorganize. We are trying to reform all dimensions of taxes to try and see how we can raise revenue. Mostly looking at the hard-to-tax economy, and this is some things that we are going to talk about. So in a sense, we are conscious about that. Half of the work that we do is how do we support development spending? How do we create that balance?
Okay, buenos dias. My name is Noki Kumbo from KTN News. 2 questions. The first one is, you've spoken about policies and a wider approach towards reforms. It's not just budget, but we can't ignore the impact.
We can't ignore?
We can't ignore the impact of the taxation element to several industries. For example, manufacturing. I mean, we've spoken to manufacturers over the discussion on Matters Finance Bill. Some of them are closing up. They are thinking about relocating. How do we counter that?
There is nothing like closing up or relocating. This is a political agenda. Let me tell you, everywhere you go, we try to balance out policies so that nobody feels disadvantaged. Okay? That is a hearsay that you're talking about. Let me tell you, there is nowhere in Kenya that you have raised taxes to the point where farms can close down. Give me an example. I've been living in this country. I've done most of the policy work in my own individual capacity, and I can tell you I have all those. Don't forget, I would like you to go and read the book that we developed in 2002 when Kenyans were so depressed, and it is restarting and sustaining growth in Kenya. You read that, and you'll tell me what you have said is incorrect. If you read that, there are several chapters, you realize that what you are really saying has no basis. It is the whole issue about policy is to balance policy reforms, to balance programs, and finally, to balance interventions. There's no way you can come up with policies that kill even a household or an industry. So let's move away from those points that have no even relevance, because it's not true. Who would want to do that?
For example, East African packaging industries.
That they have their own internal problems, my friend. You know, if you fail to compete in the world today, you cannot survive. Are we together? Let's not start an argument, because I can give you that lecture until cows come home. Huh? Okay?
All right, in closing, sir.
Yeah.
The issue of Laffer Cup, in regards to...
Yes, Njuguna there talking to, addressing the media right there about the budget, talking about an economic recovery that you have seen in the last 2-3 years, but he painted a picture for us in terms of how the economy has grown in the last couple of years, talking about how inflation has come down to about 5.1% as of May. Remember, this was just a marginal increase from 5% that was recorded in April. And he was just defending the tax proposals or the tax measures that have been proposed in the Finance Bill 2024 and why we need those tax measures in order to grow our economy as well as address emerging issues and also address the public debt. I'll take a short commercial break and then we come back to the guests right here in studio as they get to react to what the Cabinet Secretary for National Treasury has said.